Hello, everyone, and today I would like to discuss a topic that is professionally very close to me: how compliance works in Japan, the United States, and Scandinavia. And why I decided to choose this topic, because I worked with the companies US based, Japan based, and Scandinavian. I mainly refer to Denmark, basically, when I talk about the Scandinavia, where I currently work and live. And from my experience, compliance approaches across Scandinavia are broadly similar with some local nuances. So that's why let's generalize today a little bit and talk about the Scandinavia as a whole. So let's break down into three dimensions. And the first dimension is the compliance framework. And when I talked about the compliance framework, I primarily mean the governance, the regulation, and some internal and external governance. Then the internal control discipline and documentation culture. So, compliance framework, what it is about? And as I already mentioned, it is about the governance, it's about the regulation and legislation around the compliance subject. So, let's start with the frameworks itself. Of course, for these three different countries, there are very different frameworks, but there are a lot of similarities at the same time. In the United States, compliance for, and here I want to specify it, listed public companies is largely shaped by the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, commonly known as SOX, S-O-X. Don't mix up with the socks that you're wearing every day. SOX was introduced in 2001-2002 following major corporate scandals such as Enron and WorldCom. If you want to hear a little bit more about the scandals or what is the SOX about and how it's evolved, just let me know. And it was created to strengthen the corporate governance, internal controls, and of course the financial reporting reliability. Because prior to that, we were all relying only into the external audit certification. Japan actually followed a similar path with the J-SOX, Japanese SOX, and formally introduced in 2008. And by the way, the J-SOX is not official naming, but it's a very largely known as a J-SOX. And J-SOX, of course, was heavily inspired by the US SOX and focused on internal controls over financial reporting, again, for the listed companies. Again, it happened because of different fraud cases. So, from a framework perspective, US SOX and Japanese SOX are conceptually look alike, and they are very much alike. The key difference is basically in the testing and the intensity, and of course in the execution intensity. The US SOX typically involves continuous internal control evaluation, right, with strong external audit involvement, while J-SOX is really slightly different and less robust or rigid and less granular and more annual in nature. So basically for SOX, we had to do the quarterly examination, whereas for the J-SOX, you need to do the annual examination by the internal audit and of course the external audit. Now it's a time to look at Scandinavia and especially Denmark. Then, as I already mentioned, then the culture is different. And of course, culture shapes your compliance governance. First of all, there is no SOX equivalent framework in Denmark. Instead, again, publicly traded companies driven by the, as they're calling it, if it's a direct translation, Danish Financial Statement Act, and of course the EU level regulation. Here I also want to specify that, of course, Denmark is primarily driven by the Danish Financial Statement Act. These requirements are significantly lighter compared to SOX or J-SOX and focus primarily on accurate financial reporting rather than formalized internal control testing. You can feel already the difference, right? The difference in the perspective, difference in the regulation, in the framework. So in practice, the Scandinavian frameworks relies much more on the principles, management responsibility, and external audit, rather than on a prescriptive internal controls, frameworks, and of course, the regulation. The topic number 2, internal control discipline. We will be talking about the discipline, and then you will also see how different these 3 countries are operating. And here, what I want to say when I'm talking about the discipline, this is where the cultural differences become very visible and where the culture is pretty much influencing your corporate governance. As you maybe know, in the United States, compliance is the rule-driven. So controls exist because the law requires to have them. If controls is defined, designed, it must be executed as it is designed, exactly as it is designed. Even if controls feels overwhelming, inefficient, etc., deviation creates an incompliance issue. So this creates a very straightforward and maybe I would say evidence-based internal control framework. You need to prove that you did execute the controls, even though you might not like them, even though they might not be effective or efficient per design, the people would follow that. I would not say blindly, but because it is the strong evidence-based discipline. In Japan, discipline is even stronger, but it doesn't come from the regulation. It comes from the culture itself. As I said, it is influenced by the culture. There are different reasons. First of all, compliance is deeply tied to honor, responsibility, and collective accountability, which is very much descriptive for the Japan culture. Rules are followed not primarily because of fear or penalties or because it's regulative requirements, but because non-compliance reflects on personal and organizational integrity. It is a pride, it is integrity of how and dignity and how I do execute my duties, how I do service my company. By the way, quality and compliance are often treated as a one integrated concept, which is of course creating another layer of quality in the internal control perspective. A common mindset is if you cannot comply, you must explain, but you must explain clearly, transparently, and of course, respectfully. And if you cannot, then you're not honored, you do not have a dignity. So you see, what is the difference between being evidence-driven and being honor and pride-driven? Let's go to Scandinavia. Scandinavia operates on a fundamentally different logic. Here, the system is built on trust. You would say it's very good. Yeah, trust is good, but I think control is better. Nevertheless, employees are trusted by default. Controls are often perceived as signals of mistrust rather than safeguards. Feel the difference? Preventive controls are frequently challenged on the grounds of the lack of the flexibility, equality, and autonomy. So there is a question why you do need to have this control. You don't trust me? And that's a very nasty question in the Danish organization, in the Danish culture. As a result, compliance discipline is weaker, not because of bad intentions, but because the cultural discipline, right? This cultural baseline, which assumes that ethical behavior without formal enforcement, right, So for compliance professionals, this creates a bottleneck. This creates basically a very, I would say, in a good words, unique challenge that you do have a standards, they do exist, but adherence is often negotiable in practice. So basically in the US, it's not negotiable. In Japan, it's not negotiable because of pride. And here it's negotiable, of course. You can imagine what is a nightmare to be a compliance professional here. And the number 3, it's a documentation culture. It's just maybe very much connected to the previous point, but nevertheless, let's briefly touch on documentation. So let's this time start from Japan. And documentation is, of course, detailed, structured, and process-driven. Of course, we know this lean, Kanban, Kaizen, it is influenced by these frameworks, which has nothing to do with the compliance, but it is something to do with the continuous improvement. And that's where they are connecting the dots. Documentation is treated as a core operational asset. Processes are documented clearly with these flow charts, ownership is defined, deviations are tracked and corrected, everyone knows what to do, there is a manual for everything you need to know about this, about the process, that no one can ever do the mistake, and if they do, then they know how to correct it. Clear, right? In the US, documentation is heavily, as I said, evidence-oriented, because you need to prove that you did execute this control. You need to adhere to the standards and prove that you are not guilty. The purpose is documentation is basically defensibility. Every control must be documented in a way that can withstand an external audit and regulatory scrutiny. So basically, this is the only reasoning. And you would say that's a very questionable reason, but nevertheless, that's also a very much US-based, evidence-based approach. In Scandinavia, documentation is often, when I say minimalistic, do you know this very famous Danish minimalistic and Scandinavian minimalistic? So the focus is on outcomes rather than the process proof. For instance, if the financial statements are correct, the journey to get there is less important unless something goes wrong. So the risk management in Scandinavia, as I always like to say, if it never happened, it's not going to happen. I think somewhere there, the risk manager just shoot himself. But that's the reality where I operated. But with all these interesting topics, I didn't want to offend someone. I just wanted to show the difference. None of these models are objectively right or wrong. They, as I already mentioned, reflect a different legal system, cultures, and views on responsibility and trust. And understanding these differences is very much critical for anyone who is working in global compliance, internal audit, internal control, compliance, or any other governance roles. So I hope it was interesting for you to listen, and I hope that you will write me some notes that what you would like to hear, maybe about Scandinavia, maybe about Japan, maybe about US-based companies. But I really appreciate your time and see you around.